In high school, I played soccer with my brother Daniel, who is 2 years younger than I am. During my senior year, I was elected as the captain of the team, and Daniel was a sophomore. When it was time to select underclassmen to move up to the varsity team, I had a meeting with the other captain and our coach. For as long as I could remember, my parents had always complained about the underclassmen getting moved up in sports because they often saw significantly less playing time and didn't get to play with their friends anymore. Naturally, I was torn when my coach asked what I thought about moving my brother up. My coach argued that playing with the older, better opponents would be good for Daniel, but I was told otherwise my entire life, so I was skeptical of his argument. Looking back on the development of my literate proficiency, I see that there is some legitimacy to the idea that development occurs more rapidly when the developing individual is surrounded by others with more experience. I went to a small Catholic school through 5th grade, and every morning the entire school met for announcements and morning prayers. The prayers were read by students, and the first time I was picked to read the prayers, I was terrified. I was only a first grader, still learning basic English reading skills, and I had to read in front of the entire school. I felt completely out of my league. I loved raising my hand to read things in class, but that was only in front of the other kids in first grade. What would the 5th graders think if I stumbled through the reading? What would the teachers think if I had to stop and sound out each syllable of a tough word? I could not let it happen. In preparation for my reading of the prayers, I sat down with my mom every night for a week, looking up the meaning of every unfamiliar word in the reading. I read and reread the passage every night. I read it out loud to my parents, my brothers, and even my neighbors. I had to make sure nothing would go wrong. This process became my routine every time I read the prayers. I prepared more for those readings than I did for any test or project in class. In my attempt to strengthen my skills to the level of those around me, I learned an immense amount. My desire to erase my inferiority was the catalyst that expedited my literate development. Last summer during my internship, I once again found myself feeling out of my league in terms of literate proficiency. I worked for Carrier as a software development intern in the electronic catalog group, where I quickly learned that academic and professional literacy are two very different things. For one project I worked on, I developed a testing procedure for a software package, and after I presented it to my manager, Mark, he asked me to write up a manual explaining the process so that it could be repeated after I left at the end of the summer. By the end of the day, I was back in Mark's office going over the draft I had written. When he was about halfway through the first page of my draft, he stopped and said that I was going to have to rewrite the whole thing. Going into my internship, I had some experience writing technical reports, and I consider myself to be a decent writer who was certainly capable of conveying ideas and concepts through words on paper. That is why I was quite surprised and embarrassed by the uselessness of the document I spent my day writing. Mark continued on to specify that what I had written was something to be handed in as an assignment in school, not something to be used as a reference in the industry. He proceeded to remove the filler, as he called it, from the first page of my draft, and suddenly a page was nothing more than a few short sentences. Mark explained that when writing in a professional environment, your goal should be to get the point across as clearly as possible in as few words as possible. He said there were two motivations to that logic. First, people who would be reading this would likely be crunched for time and looking for nothing more than a clarifying fact or detail here or there. No one would want to or be able to take the time to sort through a 10 or 15 page document on a relatively simple process. Additionally, Mark pointed out that not everyone was a native English speaker and explained that the filler is often the part of the written explanations that is hard to translate. I went back, wrote another draft, and after a few more meetings and lessons from Mark, I had a document we both deemed acceptable. I had gained a whole new perspective on professional literature. When I compared all the things I had written at work to those things that others were writing, I realized that even the way I wrote emails was not as professional as it should have been. I had a whole new set of guidelines and rules to learn. I was a first grader once again, and I had to work hard to catch up to those around me. I very quickly learned a vast amount about this different approach to literacy and broadened my understanding of literacy on a larger scale. A large part of my development with literacy has come as a result of spending time in environments where I was less knowledgeable and experienced than those around me. I was motivated to further myself by the desire to match what those around me could do. Daniel was motivated the same way that year and learned a lot by playing on the varsity team. I mentioned briefly that for my internship I worked with software. In school I have a minor in computer science, which has taught me an extensive amount about programming and the inner workings of computers. Until college, however, I was not very knowledgeable with computers at all. I very rarely worked with computers before college because the computer my family had was frustratingly slow. What I did know about computers and the internet, I learned in school. I remember the first time I used a computer was in pre-kindergarten. Again, at the small Catholic school I previously mentioned, we had a computer class, or typing class for the very young students. At the time, we worked with old IBM machines connected to monochrome monitors that only had green text. Those machines were sufficient enough for teaching us the basics of typing. It wasn't until the third grade, however, that I was introduced to the internet. For a project on dinosaurs, I remember that we had to look on the computer using an old search engine, Ask Jeeves, which has since been changed to Ask.com. At the time, I didn't understand the significance of the internet, and I thought it was simply like using a tool I was simply using a tool like the CD encyclopedias I had at home, but I would quickly learn how much more the internet had to offer. That small school was also the first place I experienced a second language. Starting in preschool, I had a Spanish class once every week. When I was very young, I didn't pick up on a lot of the Spanish I was being taught, as I didn't use it in my everyday life. But with repetition and about 13 more years of Spanish classes, I did learn to be quite proficient with the language. I studied Spanish throughout middle school and until junior year of high school. With the Spanish club, I traveled to Spain twice, where I was able to get a very good feel for the real use of the language. In the 4 years since my junior year of high school, I've used almost no Spanish, and as such, I have forgotten almost everything I learned. I wish I remembered more of what I once knew, but hopefully if I try to pick it up again, it will come back quickly.